The Rebbe Zolgazunsein began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is Shabbos Mevorchim. And the idea of Shabbos Mevorchim is that it always combines 2 months. It's a bracha for the incoming month, for the month which we are going into. In general, Shabbos gives bracha to the entire week, to the entire forthcoming week. And Shabbos Mevorchim gives bracha not only to the forthcoming week, but to the entire month. As well, however, Shabbos Mevorchim always has to be in the month which we are going out of. So here we have Shabbos Mevorchim as a day which combines both months. The month which we are leaving, which in this case happens to be the month of Tammuz, and the month which we are about to enter, which is the month of Av. And Shabbos Mevorchim combines these 2 inyan. So this in itself shows us the greatness of Shabbos Mevorchim. As the Rebbe Gesundheit stressed, when something or someone is in a position of combining 2 inyanim, that means that this specific inyan has to stand yet higher from both of these inyanim. The same applies b'negei to this Shabbos. The Shabbos is higher than both of the inyanim. That is why Shabbos can be mechaber, can combine these 2 great inyanim. And b'negei Shabbos Mevorchim in general, we know how the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was the Baal HaGeula of the month which we are leaving now, the month of Yud Beis Tammuz, stressed and related to us the greatness of having a Chassidische Farbrengen on a Shabbos Mevorchim. And there's a famous quotation which the Frierdiker Rebbe related in behalf of the Alter Rebbe, that a Chassidische Farbrengen can accomplish more than Malach Michael. And we all know the greatness of Malach Michael. Malach Michael is the Saron Shel Yisrael. He's the Sar, he's the Malach which is appointed above all of Klal Yisrael. And he is the one that always protects Klal Yisrael. So here we are told that a Chassidish Farbrengen is that great that it can accomplish more than Malach Michael can accomplish. So this is the inyan of making a Chassidish Farbrengen on every Shabbos Mevorchim in general. To such an extent are we told about the greatness of Michael, that Michael in numerical value totals 101. What is 101? So it's explained in Chassidus based on what is explained in Tanya, that when we talk up to number 100, it's an inyan of gvul, of a limitation. However, when we go above number 100, it reflects the idea of beli gvul. So the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya in Perik Yudalad and Perik Tesvav the idea of an Oved Elokim and a Lo Yavoda, one who serves the Rebishter, one who is not serving the Rebishter. What is considered one serving the Rebishter when he goes outside of his limitations? That is why the Alter Rebbe explains, the Gemara says, Einei doime sheine pirkei meya pa'amim l'sheine pirkei meya ve'echot pa'amim. If one chazas over 100 times, or if one chazas over 101 times, if one chazas over 101 times, he is considered an Oved Elokim. And the Alter Rebbe explains what is the difference. It seems like in those days it didn't learn from Svarim, so it was common to chazar over an inyan 100 times. So this was the usual method. However, if one goes above the usual method and does different than the usual custom is, and chazars 101, this reflects an inyan of beli gvul, going outside of the standard limitation of serving the Rebishter. The same, we are told that the numerical value of Michael totals 101. So this in itself shows us that the inyan of Michael reflects an inyan of beli gvul. And however, at the same time, which this shows us how great Malach Michael is. And at the same time, we are told that a Chassidish Farbrengen can accomplish more than Malach Michael. How much more so, the Rebbe went on, is it when we find the special kviyus in a Shabbos Mevorchim, like today, and when we find something special, there's a special lesson, a special hayroya which we can derive from this specific year. But the lesson which we derive is applicable not only to this year, but to other years as well, to future years to come. And particularly based on the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that every inyan is Ashgacha Pratis, and from every inyan we come across, we have to derive a lesson in Avodas Hashem. And also, based on what we say in davening every day, Davar shehoya biklal, v'yotza min haklal, lelamed ala klal kula yotza. If there is some exception, it comes to teach us not only on this specific case, but it's lelamed ala klal kula. It teaches us on the entire concept of Shabbos Mevorchim of, as we will get to in a few minutes. However, what is the inyan of Shabbos Mevorchim of, which combines these 2 months? Shabbos Mevorchim of is already in the midst of Bein HaMetzorim. It must be. Shabbos Mevorchim of always falls out after Shivasa B'Tammuz, so it's already in the midst of Bein HaMetzorim. So the Rebbe Zalgazunsan is asking, though we know Bein HaMetzorim isn't such a great inyan, and here we say that this is such a great Shabbos, that this Shabbos is higher than both of the inyanim that it combines. And what is the inyan of this Shabbos? That this Shabbos is in Bein HaMetzorim. Bein HaMetzorim isn't so outstanding. In order to understand this, the Rebbe also referred to a Rashi in Chumash, and in Chumash Bereishis, and as this Rashi is explained in Chassidus. There's a pasuk, Eila Toildos Yankov V'Esav. So Rashi there comments, it's the Toildos Yankov V'Esav Ha'amurim B'Parsha, which is discussed in the Parsha. The question is raised, what does Rashi add on in his interpretation? Naturally, we're talking about Yankov V'Esav. This is the Sedra that's telling all the details about the children of Yitzchak. Here the pasuk says that it's discussing their Toildos, everything that transpired throughout their lives, major inyanim. So Rashi adds on, Ha'amurim B'Parsha. Naturally, which other Yankov V'Esav are we talking about? So Chassidus explains, there is the Esav that we know as the Esav in Olam Hazeh, who was the wild Esav, but there is a higher level, there is Ha'amurim B'Parsha. There is as Yankov and Esav stand in Parsha, stand in Torah. And there, it is not the Esav that's familiar to us in the negative way. There it's talking on a much higher spiritual level, and that is what Rashi's meram is. There's a Yankov Esav Ha'amurim B'Parsha. Because otherwise, we know that Yankov was named Yaakov. Why? Because Yoda Yechezes Ba'akev Esav. Yaakov, as he was coming out of Rivka, he was holding on to the toe of Esav. So Pshat, Yaakov was holding on to Esav's heel. However, being that we are talking here about a different Esav, we're talking about an Esav Ha'amurim B'Parsha. It's a different level of Yankov Esav. It's not the Yankov Esav from the world, from Welt. It's a Yankov Esav, how they are reflected in Parsha, which were, in other words, it's Yankov Esav in a ruchnistic level. Same the Rebbe says is Benegeh. Bein HaMetzorim as well. There's the Bein HaMetzorim as we take it, and what we know of Bein HaMetzorim. However, there's a higher ruchnistic level of Bein HaMetzorim, and this is what this Shabbos contains within itself. And in this ruchnistic level of Bein HaMetzorim, this Shabbos combines these 2 months, the month of Tammuz and the month of Av. What is the Kriya B'Torah which we read today? A combination of 2 sedras, Matos and Masei. Matos mustn't necessarily be read in Shabbos Mevorchim of. Could be years it is read in Shabbos Mevorchim of, and there are years when Matos and Masei are separate, so Matos is definitely read still in the month of Tammuz. Masei at times could be in the month read Shabbos Mevorchim of, and Masei could also be read on Shabbos Rish Chodesh of. Should Rish Chodesh of fall out on a Shabbos, then Masei would be read on that Shabbos. Devarim is always read before Tisha B'Av, because if Rish Chodesh of falls out on a Shabbos, there is still another Shabbos between Rish Chodesh of and Tisha B'Av, because a week does not have 9 days, a week has less. So therefore, if Rish Chodesh of falls out on Shabbos, Masei is read on Rish Chodesh of, Dvarim is read on Shabbos Chazon, the Shabbos preceding Tisha B'Av. This year we have it different. We have Matos and Masei coming together, combined. And the lesson which we can derive from Matos and Masei combined, which is an inyan which we have this year, that's what the Rebbe referred to in the beginning. However, this lesson we can carry with us for all the years to come as well, even when Matos and Masei will fall out to be on separate weeks. Prior to this inyan, the Rebbe referred that the B'negei Parshas Masei. Parshas Masei in Lubavitch, Bechlal, we know that there are only 7 people called up to the Kriya on Shabbos. However, there are other communities which make what it's called hafsakos. They interrupt. If they want to give more aliyahs to more people, they would make an interruption in middle. In other words, we read till Sheni, or between Sheni and Shlishi, they would interrupt earlier than the official hefsek comes, and thereby they would be in a position of giving more aliyahs. Whether they're more chiyuvim or simchas or whatever the occasion may be in various shuls. However, even for those that hold of giving additional aliyahs, which we would call making hafsakis in the middle of the kriya, in the hafsakis, hoisafis, right? I'm sorry, thank you. Which means they make a hafsakah and they add on more aliyahs. However, b'negei Parshas Masei, it's brought that it's not advisable to be mafsik in the middle of Parshas Masei. Rabbi explained why. Masois, these are journeys. These are various journeys which the Yidden made as they left Mitzrayim. 42 Masois. 42 different journeys which the Yidden went through all the years in the Midbar. However, it's explained in Svarim and it's explained in Chassidish Svarim. Chassidus stresses it a lot that these Masois refer to the general journeys, to the general Masois which Yidden go throughout the entire Golus. Until coming to Yad and Yerechai, meaning coming to Yad and Yerechai with the Gula Hasidah, with the Gula to come, through Mashiach Tzidkenu. Therefore, the Rebbe says, in the middle of the Masois, we don't want to make any interruptions. What's the pshat? We make an interruption means we would call up a new person and have somebody new make a bracha, with a new hafsaka, with a new interruption in the middle of the journeys. In the middle of all these journeys, we want a chaparain. We don't want to make any hafsakas. We want at the coming of Mashiach. And the Gula should be thus faster. What fast it should be. So therefore, in the middle of this inyan, it's not advisable to make any interruptions. Because the journey is a long enough journey as it is, and we don't want to add in anything additional with an interruption of somebody having to make the closing bracha on an aliyah and then calling in somebody else to make an opening bracha on his aliyah and then close his aliyah again. Getting back to the combination of the sedras of Matos-Masei, when Sedra begins about Matos, and the Sedra really refers to Shvatim. And a Shevet, a tribe, is referred here in the Sedra as a Mata. Actually, why does the Torah use here a different expression than it is used in most other places when the Torah refers to a Shevet? What is the difference between the expression of Shevet and the expression of Mata? Rabbi Zolzhenson explained, a Shevet means a branch. A branch of a tree is a shevet. However, a mata is a strong stick. In other words, when we use the expression shevet as opposed to mata, mata is much firmer and much stronger than a shevet. The same thing here, the Torah is talking about Yidden, in the sense when Yidden have to exercise the firmness, the strength which each and every Yid possesses. And that is why it's particular so that this inyan here, which is discussed in the beginning of Parshas Matos, is the inyan of Nedarim. What's the inyan of Nedarim? A Yid takes upon himself an extra thing. Something which Minat Torah is not required to do. And he's taking upon himself to fulfill something extra. He's making an additional obligation. He's asering himself. He's depriving himself from something more which the Torah has told him to. And there's an interesting expression in the Yerushalmi. Rabbi says, we know Chassidus always stresses Yerushalmi opposed to Bavli. Bavli is considered an inyan of Choshech, and Yerushalmi is considered an inyan of Oyer, light. But Machshakim, Hashivani, the Gemara says, the Talmud Bavli. Reason for it is because in Bavli there's always Kashas and Terutzim. However, in Yerushalmi we approach an inyan straight without having to go back and forth in terms of Kashas and Terutzim. So the Yerushalmi uses the expression B'negei Nedarim, Dayoch b'mesha oschas Torah. It's enough what the Torah has told you that you're not allowed to do, and you're going and taking something additional upon yourself, and an additional obligation, depriving ourselves from other things which the Torah has told us not to do. More things. in the emes, this is a step, as the Gemara uses the expression, Nidarim Syag Leprishos. When one wants to separate himself from Inyana Elam Hazeh, Nidarim, accepting upon himself, Nidarim, which means additional Inyanim, which the Torah has not told us to do. In other words, the Torah didn't say anything about it. And he's accepting upon himself to deprive himself from this Inyan as well. This is an Inyan of Neder. So for a Yid to be able to fulfill a Neder, it is required an extra amount of firmness. Otherwise, why should he accept upon himself in Yonim which the Torah didn't even say we shouldn't do? And he's accepting upon himself, as the expression goes, Kadesh Atzmacha v'mutalach. We are sanctifying ourselves even with things which we are allowed to do. We don't, if these are Gashmis Dikei we don't want to get close to them. So this is something which requires a tremendous koyach, a tremendous strength within Yidden to be able to live up to such a standard, to be able to fulfill a neder. That is why the Torah here does not refer to Yidden with the title of Shevet, but rather with the title of a Mata. Mata meaning Taka also tribe Shevet. However, Mata here means a strong stick. Why? Because this reflects a tremendous amount of strength which is required from a Yid in order that he should be able to fulfill a neder, to fulfill an additional obligation, taking upon himself an additional yoke. Kaddish, atzmacha b'mutalach. There's something which we are allowed to do, it is mutar upon us. However, as a feeling of extensive Yirei Shemayim, individual has the right to accept upon himself that he will stay away from certain Gashmis Dikinyonim. He will deprive himself from these Gashmis Dikinyonim. When can he be able to exist and hold out on such a decision? This is when he has this extra strength, this extra firmness within him. So this is the idea of Matos. Together with the combination of the Sedras of Matos and Masei, it is also 28 days in the month of Tammuz today. What is so special b'negei 28 days in the month? So let us look at the Shir Tilim, which we recite on Chof Ches in the Tilim. The Shir Tilim, which is recited today, has within it a kapitel Tilim, the kapitel of Hoidu Lashem Ki Toiv Ki Lo Olam Chasdoi, which as the Gemara refers to it with a title of Halel HaGodel. This is the great Halel. Or another expression in Gemara is Halel HaMitzri. In other words, there's the Hallel which we know as Hallel, which we recite on Rosh Chodesh. That is in Tilim in Kapitel Kuf Yud Dalet. However, this Hallel, which is in Kapitel Kuf Lamed Vav, which each and every pasuk concludes with a Kila Olam Chazdoi, this, as explained in Sfarim, is a yet higher madrege in Hallel. So that is why Pesach by the Seder, first we recite Hallel, the regular Hallel, which is known to us as the Hallel. Afterwards, being that it comes afterwards, the pshat that it is higher in the spiritual level as well. Because the Yid keeps on going mimadregel to madregel from one step to another. So going in a yet higher level, we come to this Hallel HaGodel, to this great Hallel, which is in Kapitel Kuf Lamed Vav, which is the second kapitel of today's Yom. And before that comes as an introduction Kapitel Kuf Lamed Hey, which also is an Inyan of a Hallelujah, which is also some sort of a Hallel. And to give us an understanding on the greatness of Hallel, the Rebbe quoted a Gemara. There's a Gemara that tells us that by Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, when he saw the great miracles which HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed with him, he did not recite Hallel. And had Chizkiyahu recited Hallel then, the Gemara says, then it wouldn't have come to the whole Inyan of Golus. Rebbe says, could we imagine how great Hallel is? We would have avoided the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the Golus that came afterward. We would have avoided the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And we would have avoided the Golus which we are in, the long and bitter Golus which we are so anxious to get out of. All of this, if Chizkiyahu would have recited a proper Hallel, a proper praise to the Rebishter, at the time when the Rebishter performed the Nisim to Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda. From here we see the greatness of the Inyan of Hallel. And this day, 28 days in the month, the Yom Tehillim, which as Tehillim is divided according to the month, and which is one of the takonas of the Friedrich Rebbe of Chitas, reciting Tehillim, as Tehillim is divided on a monthly basis, On this day, we say these kapitlach, which are called in Gemara Halel HaGadol. So this also shows us the greatness of this day. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe says the usual is to learn a Rashi in this week's Sedra, and after, which is Torah Shebiksav, which in a sequence they should come first. Then we come to the Zohar, to commentary of the Rebbe's father, which is an Indian in Torah Shebal Peh. Then we come to an Indian in Pirkei Avos, which is learned on a weekly basis whenever there's a Farbrengen in the summer months. And something additional is the Indian that in the 3 weeks we know that there's a strong request from the Rebbe, and the Rebbe requested it again today, to utilize the 3 weeks in learning in Yonim that have a Shaykhis to Beis HaMikdash. And therefore the Kapitlach in Yecheskel and the Rambam, which deals with Beis HaMikdash, Rambam Hilchas Beis HaBchira. Therefore the Rebbe says, today we will also learn an Inyan in the Rambam Hilchas Beis HaBchira. And in the Farbrengen again, the Rebbe mentioned how he's asking everyone very strongly to make Kviyas and Kviyasit and B'Torah during the period of the 3 weeks to learn these Inyanim that have a Shaykhis to the Inyan of Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe commented, though it may seem strange to learn an Inyan and Nigla and a Rambam and the Shabbos to Farbrengen, however, the Rebbe says, even those that will look at it this way, how do we learn Nigla and the Shabbos to Farbrengen? Let us hope that we will soon be able to have these Inyanim which we are learning about, which is the Inyanim of Beis HaMikdash. We should be able to have these Inyanim b'Nigla. Obvious. We should be able to have the Beis HaMikdash, the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And this is something which we all definitely agree to. The Rebbe referred also, twice in fact in the Farbrengen, Benegeya, an arrangement which was made by the Agudas Harabanim, that tomorrow's day, Erev Rosh Chodesh Av, should be set aside as a Yom Tefillah, a special day of Tefillah, a special day of prayer. The Rebbe said, Bichlal, we know the greatness of a Yom Tefillah when it's proclaimed by Rabbanim, and the Rebbe referred that in olden days, or now as well in other communities, it is found in many shuls that on the Omed, where the Chazan stands, there's an inscription, Dalif Name Miyata Omed, to know whom we stand for. Or in some shuls, not only do they have that, but they have complete drawings, complete diagrams in front of the Omed, which keep on stressing the greatness, how we are supposed to concentrate ourselves and unite ourselves with the Rabbeinu Shalom, whom we are davening to. The Rebbe says he always looked at this custom very strange. Why? Very simple. Because the Chazan who's davening for the Amid, his Inyan is to be able to concentrate himself on the Tefillah, on what he's davening, and to be able to think the Taich, or the words that he's davening, whether it's the beginning of the Shemoneh Esrei, or the introduction to Shemoneh Esrei, or the middle brachas, or the end brachas, whatever specific Inyan we may be talking about. The idea of the Chazan is to be able to have proper kavanah to keep his mind on the Pirush HaMilas. And if he has in front of him drawings and different type of quotations, it definitely distracts his mind, how holy the contents of these drawings may be. However, at the same time, we do see that the idea of these drawings were to prove the idea of tefillah, that the whole concept of tefillah is that we are concentrating ourselves to become united with the Rebishter. This is what tefillah is all about. So when Rabbanim proclaimed the Yom Tefillah, a special day of tefillah, and particularly that this day is on an Erev Rosh Chodesh, and we know the Rebbe says that Erev Rosh Chodesh is very suitable to have a special Yom Tefillah. And that is why the Rebbe also says it's brought in Svarim that for those that want to go be mishtateach, to go and be daven on a kever of a tzaddik, the most suitable days for it are days of a day like Erev Rosh Chodesh, or the 15th of the month. So that getting back to our Inyan, Erev Rosh Chodesh is a very suitable day. Incidentally, that is why probably the Rebbe always on the 15th of the month and on Erev Rosh Chodesh on both always goes to the oil on both of these days in every month. So getting back to this Inyan, it is extremely important that we should follow this suggestion of adopting this day as a Yom Tefillah, and the Rebbe says we should utilize to influence our acquaintance and other people as well, and being that this will be done not only here in the United States, but by Yidden and Eretz Yisrael as well, so it's a tremendous Inyan of Achdus. It's uniting Yidden from here and from other countries, from Eretz Yisrael, and is putting Yidden into a position of a tzibur. And a Yom Tefillah of a tzibur is treasured by the Rebbe in a completely different way. The Rebbe said it's brought in Svarim that the word tzibur, which means a group, a public group, is Rashi Teves abbreviates tzadikim, beinanim, ureshoyim. Tzibur spelled with a vav. A vav, Chassidus stresses, always shows an hamshacha. In other words, it comes as a continuation. What is the idea of tzibur? This is a day when tzadikim, beinanim, and reshoyim are all joining in together, and all as a whole are approaching the Rebishter, asking for tefillah and bakasha on this specific day. The details of the Yom Tefillah are hanging in 770 and probably in all shuls, which is from the Agudas HaRabbanim, and it is signed by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, which gives a suggestion, a recommendation of various kapitlach tilim, which we are to recite on tomorrow's day. B'negei the Inyan of Miftzayim, the Rebbe went on, it is also extremely appropriate that on these days, in the days that are 3 weeks, to utilize the Inyan of all of the Miftzayim, and particularly starting with Avas Yisrael. It's extremely appropriate to utilize a full measure of Avas Yisrael in these days that are 3 weeks. Why? Because the Gemara tells us that the reason for the Churban HaBayis was Sinas Chinam. The Yidden had hatred one to another without any reason. So in order to compensate for that, we have to have now Avas Chinam, love to each and every Yid, also without any reason, just loving our fellow Jew because he's our fellow Jew, to such an extent that it will lead not only to total and ultimate of Avas Yisrael, but to the highest level of Achdus Yisrael, total unity that can only be amongst Yidden, and as well B'negei all the other 10 Miftzayim, and as well the Inyan of Miftzah Sefer Torah, that those Yidden who as yet do not have an us and Sefer Torah, to acquire for them and for their families an us and any of the Sefer Torah, which are, their goal is the unity of Klal Yisrael. And another particular request, which the Rebbe Zalgazunzai mentioned this afternoon, she has referred to in previous years as well, is B'negei the Inyan of making a siyum, making siyumim, completion of Masechtes, during the 9 days. The Rebbe said it was revealed to us by the Frierdiker Rebbe that his father, the Rebbe Matos-Masei, also was accustomed to make siyums during the 9 days. However, he did not, following the siyum, celebrate with eating meat and drinking wine. He just made a siyum for the cause of a siyum and being Messiah and Masechta. Rebbe says, naturally, it is not our inyan. How can we come close to compare ourselves to the Rebbe Matos-Masei, Frierdiker Rebbe's father? However, being that this attitude, these minhagim, were revealed to us by his son, the Frierdiker Rebbe, it's a siman that it does have a shaykhs to us. And we can imagine if the Rebbe Rashab would have been making siyums and also making a suda with basar v'yayin following the siyum, then we can imagine what the attitude of Hasidim would be. Then all Hasidim would definitely be making tremendous sudas during the 9 days following the siyum, because if this would have been the attitude of the Rebbe Matos-Masei to do so. But again, as it seems, the Rebbe Rashab did not follow the siyum with a festive meal with a festive fleishig meal and drinking wine coming afterwards. It was just the inyan of making a siyum during the 9 days. And the Rebbe requests that we should also make siyumim, those that can, and participate in siyumim during the 9 days, and as well as B'negei, the day of Tisha B'Av. There are those in Yonim which we are allowed to learn in Tisha B'Av, not everything we're allowed to learn in Tisha B'Av, to make a siyum on a Masechta which we are permitted to learn in Tisha B'Av. B'negei, the Yonim, the Rebbe Zalgazunzai learned in today's Farbrengen, Allah Seidah. It is in the end of Parshas Matos, Kapitel Lamed Beis, Pasuk Mem Aleph. Torah tells us, Yoir ben Menashe, Yoir the son of Menashe, Holach went ahead, Vayilkoi des Chaviseyen, Vayikra esen Chavis Yohir. So Rashi comments, what is the taich of Chavisein? Actually, it's the first time and the only time in Chumash we have this word Chavisein. So the Rashi has to taich it. So Rashi taiches, it means Kfar Nehoin, it means a village. That there were villages which Yoyer conquered. And how did he name these villages? Chavais Yoyer, the villages of Yoyer. Why did he name them so? Rashi goes on. Yoyer did not have any children. Karam Bishmoi was the Kari. That is why he named these areas in his name to commemorate his own name. The emes is that Rashi taiches Chaviseim, a village. The Targum also says the same, Kfar Nehoin. But Rashi in his Pirush does not make any mention to the Targum. Neither does he say Kitargumoi, which Rashi does at many occasions. When Rashi feels like teaching a word like the Targum, he says Kitargumoi. Rashi doesn't do that. Rashi teaches us that what does Chaviseim mean? A Chava means a Kfar, means a village. Also, for what Indian is it negayah to Rashi to get involved? Why Yoyer named these villages after his own name? We find way back in Chumash Bereishis, we find in Chumash Bereishis that also a city was named in the name of Chanoich, and it was done because of love to him. And it mustn't necessarily mean that because Yoyer did not have any children, didn't leave any children, that is why he named these villages in his behalf. Furthermore, the Rebbe asked, if we look into Tanakh Yehoshua, we find that Yoyer didn't only conquer these villages, Yoyer helped conquering a tremendous amount of cities. A total of 60 cities. So if Yoyer wanted to commemorate his own name, that being that he didn't have any children, that his name should be, that a city, an area should be named after him, why did he only name the villages after him? Why not a city? Could have named a huge city, which he was involved in helping conquer, that this city should be named Yoyer. He didn't do that. The Rebbe Zalzunsan is explaining this basically. Here we read in the Torah, a few psukim prior to this, how the Yidden conquered many, many cities. And if we look back a few psukim to Pasuk Lamed Ches, Pasuk says, Ves Nevoi, Ves Baal Moin, Musabay Shem. What means Musabay Shem? Rashi tells us that these cities, their names were changed to different names. Why? Because their previous names had some sort of a reflection on the union of Avodah Zarah. So that is why they gave these cities different names, these cities. However, the Torah does not tell us what were the different names that were given to all these cities. Torah does not mention it. We have to know it even for many halachic inyanim. If we write a shtar in a city, we have to know what name the city has. This is not the inyan of Torah Shebiksav to get involved and to relate to us in detail all the detailed names of all the cities which the Yidden conquered. And that is why the Torah does not get involved in it. However, here, it is different. Yoyer ben Menashe, halach vayilke des Chaviseim. So the question immediately arises, what is the taich of Chaviseim? The Even Ezra Take does not taich like Rashi and the Targum, that it means a village. The Even Ezra taiches Chaviseim means Ayorot, means a city. However, Targum does not teach so. And Rashi himself is also convinced, not just mitzat kitargumai. Rashi himself, as we will see in a minute why, is compelled in Pshutei Shel Mikra that we cannot teach Chavisein meaning a city, we must teach Chavisein that it means a village. Why? Being that Yoyer did not have any children. Yoyer did not have children, so therefore he wanted to name something after him. Pshat. If we look in Torah always, we find the arrangement the way an Av and a Bain, the arrangement of an Av and a Bain is that a Bain, a son, is always tuffled to the father. In other words, the father is the main Inyan, and the Ben, the child, comes along to the father. That is why, in order for Yoyer, who wanted to name a city after him, have a place named after him rather, it wasn't suitable he should go ahead and name a large city. This wouldn't reflect the thought which he had in mind. It would be more practical and more to reflect his idea to name a village. In other words, a village is something small. Just like a child is small in comparison to the father, the village is small in comparison to a city. That is why, being that the reason that Yoyer named these places were Lefisha Lehoyer Leibanim, Karam Bishma, he called them in his name, and as Rashi goes on stressing Lizikarim, to commemorate something that should remain constantly, eternally, referring to Yoyer. Based on this, we have to teach Chavisayim, meaning Kfarnein. That is why Rashi doesn't only quote Kitargumai, Rashi brings Mamish the whole Pirush. That the teich of a Chavis is a village. And a village is something small in comparison to a city. A child is something smaller in comparison to an adult. Because the same idea is reflected here. And that is why Vayikra Esen Chavis Yor, they were called Chavis Yor. Yor did not call any city after him, but rather called these villages and named them after him. B'negei Pirkei Avos, today, for those sticking to the custom that we recite Pirkei Avos throughout the entire summer, it is the second Perik Sheni. The Rebbe also spoke in Inyan, behemshach to the Pirkei Avos, which he discussed in the Farbrengen 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, the Rebbe discussed the greatness of one being an Omer Dava b'Shem Oimroi, which the Mishnah says. Mishnah in Perik Vav, Hala Marata, that whenever we say over an Inyan, it should be related, and we heard it from somebody else, we should always refer to this person. Rebbe Zilgazun sang 2 weeks ago, and today again, quoted a Mogen Avram, that the Mogen Avram paskens lahalacha, that if we hear something in somebody else's name in Inyan in Torah, and we do not repeat it in his name, it is an Inyan of Gezeilah, to such an extent. The Rebbe says, Achroinim make pilpulim, based on what grounds the Mogen Avram paskens this, that it is considered Gezeilah. However, the fact is, the Mogen Avram says it falls into the category of Gezeilah. However, Rabbi Zilgazun says, we find many Svarim which were written by Anoshim Chshurim, and they use the expression He'irani Chacham Echad, that one Chacham, one bright person, alerted me on this and this Inyan. And the question arises, why do they refer to the person anonymously and they do not refer to him by name? And particularly in light of what we just discussed, that whenever we say over an Inyan and learning in somebody's name, it is advisable to say it in his name, why isn't this mentioned the same way? I'll explain. True, there's an Inyan that when we hear something in somebody's name, it is kedai that it should always be repeated in his name. Fine. However, what is the case when you're saying over an Inyan and learning on somebody else, behalf of somebody else, but you're not accepting his opinion? What you're going to do is you're going to shlug him up. You're going to prove him wrong. So when you're proving him wrong, then it's not that advisable to mention his name, because actually what you're really doing, you're taking that person and proving him in error. So here we are touching grounds with the concept of embarrassing a person. To shlug up a person, there's no need to mention him by name. At the most, we can use the expression, Hey Rani Chacham Echad, I was alerted by a wise person, by a Talmud Chacham who raised such and such comment, or such and such question, and this individual Mechaber, this individual author of the Sefer is responding to whatever the question is. So that is why the Rebbe says, in such cases, we would rather not refer to the person by name, because what we are really doing is we are slugging him up and we're not accepting what he wanted to say. And to slug him up is touching ground with embarrassing, and we know what Chazal tell us, the great crime of being a malbim pnei chaveiroi, of embarrassing somebody. So therefore, as far as debating with him and learning, there's nothing wrong. But to go ahead and mention the name, who is the person that alerted me so that I have to go ahead and slug him up, there's no great Inyan in that. Based on this interpretation, the Rebbe Zilgazun is going to continue today and use the same expression, Hey Rani Chacham Echad, I was alerted by a Chacham Echad, by a wise Chacham, by a wise person. And the Rebbe referred to several inyanim, questions which were raised which were printed in the various Ha'aras Hatmimim, in the various periodicals which discuss Inyanim, raise various type of questions on Inyanim which were discussed in recent Farbrengens and Siches. And the Rebbe in today's Farbrengen responded to two of these particular questions which were printed in two of these various periodicals, Benegei Inyanim, which the Rebbe discussed in recent Farbrengens. One, just to mention briefly, is an Inyan which deals Benegei, the interpretation and the greatness of inviting guests to our table on a Yontif. Firstly, it's based on a halacha. There's a halacha. The halacha tells us that when we sit down to rejoice, we shouldn't rejoice only ourselves. We shall invite anybody. V'samachta, ata, uvesecha, you and your family, v'hageir, v'halevi. Invite anybody who you know does not have where to rejoice his yontif. We are told it is our obligation to invite this person. This is a halachic interpretation on the greatness of inviting guests to our yontif table. There is a more pnimistic interpretation, which is also based on a Chazal. Chazal used the expression peresh chageichem, which means when we sit down to enjoy our yontif table, and being that we're involved in a real festive meal, we may chas v'chalila go a little bit overboard, and as a result, when a person rejoices, he may lead to a little bit of wildkeit, going a little bit wild, which this is not the idea of a yontif suda. In order to forgive on this, that is why we do an act of inviting guests to our table, which this covers up in case chas v'shalom we committed anything wrong by rejoicing our yontif meal. These are two sources on the idea, on the greatness of having guests at our yontif table. And the Rebbe got involved in a lengthy, in-depth explanation what the difference would be, various differences and various, to an extent of an afkimina ledina filu, what is the reason, what is the overruling reason why we have to invite guests. The Rebbe brought a very simple example. If the reason would be just because of halacha, then if we have a guest just to one meal of yontif, it is sufficient. We fulfilled our obligation of sharing yontif with somebody else. If the idea of it is to make sure that we do not go overboard in any of the meals, then each and every meal we have to do this act of having guests at our table. Otherwise, chas v'chalila, we may do something wrong and going overboard. And in other words, the fact of having guests at the table, this is like a kapara, this is like a forgiveness, this is doing a good act which brings about forgiveness in case we will commit something wrong at the yontif table. Another inyan which the Rebbe referred to also, which he discussed in Farbrengen of 2 weeks ago, and questions were raised, it's also an inyan, raise your hands and bless the Eibishter. It's a pasuk. In fact, the Rebbe says there are some that have a custom that before, it's not in Chabad, but there are others that do have this custom that before Netilas Yadayim, they recite this pasuk, because Netilas Yadayim is the concept of raising our hands and Baruch es Hashem, blessing the Eibishter. So it's also a lengthy inyan which the Rebbe got involved in. Benegei kohanim, when they bench, when they duchen, it's also an inyan of suyidechem, of raising their hands. The question is, to what height were the kohanim supposed to raise their hands? Whether to the height of their shoulders or higher than that, which is an inyan which is discussed in Gemara, and there are various opinions in Tanoim on it and so forth. Benegei the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, today being Perik Sheni, the Rebbe selected the Mishnah Tes, which tells us about Chamisha Talmidim Hoyeloi Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had five disciples, and the Mishnah names them: Rabbi Elazar ben Hukanis, Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya, Rabbi Yosi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Esanel, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. These were the 5 disciples which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had. Then the Mishnah goes ahead, Hu HaYomein Shvacham. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would tell us the praise on each one of them. Rabbi Elazar ben Hukanis was a boir sut she'eina ma'abed tipa. He was like a ditch that each drop that gets in there is never lost. In other words, anything and everything which he ever learned in Torah remained with him. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya, Ashrei Yoladate, praised as his birth. Rabbi Yosi HaKohen is a chassid. Rab Shimon ben Asanel is a Yereichet. He fears to do a sin. Rab Lezer ben Aroch is Kemayon HaMizgaber, like a well that constantly keeps on strengthening itself. The Rebbe explained, firstly, the difference in learning. What is the Mishnah here actually explaining? These are 5 drachim in learning. 5 different attitudes how the disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai acted. Basically, there's a different terminology which can be used. There's Sinai and Oiker Horim. Sinai means one who is clear in everything. He knows all over. That's the same idea as a Boyer Sut Sheina Ma'abetipa. Somebody that no drop is lost by him. He's a Sinai. Everything, whatever he learned, he constantly remembers, he refers to it, and he possesses it. What's the Maila of a Mayan HaMizgaber? A well that constantly keeps on refreshing itself and re-strengthening itself. This is the idea of a Oiker Horim, one who tears mountains and grinds them one on another. This is the idea of one who makes pilpulim. He's very sharp, very bright in learning, and ties together in yonim from various mesechtes, from various sugyas, and he's capable of producing very, very successful pilpulim in learning. However, the Rebbe says it's very strange. What does the Mishnah mean here? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, all he had was 5 talmidim. He had 5 disciples. He didn't have any more. Furthermore, what is the second part of the Mishnah? The second part of the Mishnah is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would say as follows: if you were to take all Chachmei Yisrael and put them on one side of a scale, the Lezer ben Hukanis bekaf shniya, and Rabbi Lezer ben Hukanis on the other side, machiyas kulam. Rabbi Lezer ben Hukanis was so outstanding that he would overcome, he would weigh over all Chachmei Yisrael. Mishnah goes ahead further. Abishol says on behalf of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, kol Chachmei Yisrael bekaf maznayim. And Eliezer ben Hukanis afimoyim, even Rabbi Lezer ben Hukanis would join them. Rabbi Lezer ben Aroch was such an outstanding student that if he would go against all the Chachmei Yisrael, including Rabbi Lezer ben Hukanis, he would be machiyas kulam, he would weigh over all the Chachmei Yisrael. Rabbi says Pirkei Avos is milah de Chasidusa. What does Pirkei Avos tell us? Pirkei Avos tells us how we are to firzech, how we are to act in many inyanim beyond the call of Shulchan Aruch. Milah de Chasidusa, lifnim mishuras hadin. What kind of lifnim mishuras hadin can we derive from these various praises which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is praising his talmidim, and particularly what kind of great derech and avodas Hashem can we derive from knowing these 2 versions? If Rabbi Lezer ben Hukanis would go against all the Chachmei Yisrael, he would come out above all of them. Or the other girsa, which is Rabbi Lezer ben Aroch against all Chachmei Yisrael, including Rabbi Lezer ben Hukanis. What teaching in Milah de Chasidusa does this Mishnah teach us? The Rabbi explained as follows. First of all, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not only have 5 disciples, he had many more than 5. However, the system by the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's disciples, Talmidim, was set up in such a way that there were 5 different categories. This is what the Mishnah means. There was a category who were Sinais, who were Bekiyim. There was a category of Yirei Chet, of outstanding Yirei Shamayim. There was a category that was Mayan HaMizgabe, who were Mefalpelim, who were Ikrei Horim, V'toichnon Zeh B'zeh. There were 5 different categories of Talmidim. It doesn't mean he had 5 Talmidim, but 5 different categories that each of the many Talmidim was able to be defined by at least one of these categories. And we can imagine Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, how they acted, that they were all involved fully in learning. And each one excelled in this category which he was defined with. Comes Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and tells us, all of my Talmidim, they are all suitable to meet the criteria of one of these 5 categories. However, you should know that if we were to take all Chachmei Yisrael and put them on a scale, and go ahead and take Eliezer ben Hukanis and put him on the other side of the scale, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hukanis will supersede all of them. What does this mean? Kol Chachmei Yisrael are going on one scale. What's the pshat? All different types of categories of Talmidim which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai possessed. You'll make a combination of all of them. Rabbi Lezer ben Hurkenes was so outstanding in learning that he was able to succeed and overcome all of them. What's the pshat? This is an inyan of Midas Chassidus, the Rebbe says. Naturally, we are commanded on Talmud Torah. We have to try our best to learn Torah. But to say that one should undertake himself to excel so in Torah that im yiyu kol chachmei Yisrael bekafmei znayim, he should go ahead and go and excel in Torah above all chachmei Yisrael and be able to go on the other side of the scale and weigh and overweigh them. This is something which mitzad dem chiyuv of Talmud Torah, an individual is not obligated to learn Torah to such an extent. And Rabbi Lezer ben Hurkenes went and he sacrificed himself for the learning of Torah to such an extent which is far, far beyond the obligation of chiyuv of Talmud Torah. And that is what the Mishnah is out to stress. Then comes Abba Sholem and Mishmai. Em yiyu kol chachmei Yisrael bekafmei znayim. And Elazar ben Hurkenes afimoim. Take Elazar ben Hurkenes, whom we just told you his greatness, he will join all the chachmei Yisrael. And Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch will go on the other side of the scale. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch will override all of them. Why? Because Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch's learning of Torah was in such an extent that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch not only limited himself to any one of the 5 categories or to any 2, he was successful in all of them, and to such an extent that he went over all Chachmei Yisrael. If they were to be on one side of the scale, he would succeed and supersede them on the other side of the scale. This Mishnah shows us how B'negei Talmud Torah, Yid is supposed to give himself away much, much more than the chiyuv of Talmud Torah. And it's not Tam Mishnah, which we read, and obviously just the Mishnah telling us how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai praised his Talmidim with various types of praising. And therefore the question arises, what shaykhs do we have to this Mishnah? Or what does this Mishnah teach us in terms of Mila de Chasidusa, which is the whole lineage of Pirkei Avos? It definitely does. It's a tremendous lesson how the giveaway of how a person has to give himself away to the inyan of Torah. And this sort of dedication to Torah is not required mitzad Hilchos Talmud Torah. This can only be required mitzad Mila de Chasidusa, which this is the whole inyan of Pirkei Avos. B'negei the inyan of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, the Rebbe learned a halacha in the Rambam in Perik Hey of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, where the Rambam begins with the following words: Har HaBayis, the Mount Har HaBayis, which is the area where the Beis HaMikdash was built. Vehu Har HaMoriah. This is the same place which has another title. It is known as Har HaMoriah. Hoya Chomish Meyes Amma al Chomish Meyes Amma. What was the size? It was 500 square amas. That was the size. Also, Hoya Mukaf Chayma. It was surrounded with a wall. 500 amas square. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't mean. It was also surrounded with a chayma, with a wall. Every word in the Rambam is extremely accurate, and the Rambam here is saying halach. The Rambam is not giving any type of descriptions, he's saying halachas. In the halachas of the Rambam wants to tell us which area is known as the Har HaBayis. And it's negei la halacha. There are certain halachas, there are certain things which we are not allowed to do in the area of the Har HaBayis. So in order for us to know what is the size, the diagram of the Har HaBayis, the Rambam gives it to us. The Rambam goes a step further and also tells us Hoya Mukaf Chayma, which means that if there is no wall surrounding the Har HaBayis, then there's something lacking in the Har HaBayis. However, the question is, Al Pi Halacha, why does the Rambam have to add on the words Har HaBayis v'hu Har HaMoriah? If we were to ask any person, what is more popular? Is it the title Har HaBayis, or is it the title Har HaMoriah? Naturally, the title Har HaBayis. So the Rambam wants to tell us, what is the Har HaBayis? The Har HaBayis, who Har HaMoriah? I'll use the expression in Gemara we find, Toli Tane B'Daloi Tane. Mishnah times wants to give us an explanation, so the Mishnah chaps on an inyan which is not known, and is trying to explain it with the unknown inyan. The same thing is here. The Rambam is trying to give us an explanation. But we shall refer to Har HaBayis, who Har HaMoriah? Very strange. And every word in the Rambam is extremely accurate. And the Rambam is not just doing it to tell us the various names which the mountain had. That's not the inyan of the Rambam. So that we must say that the Rambam has something, lahalacha, which is negei lahalacha, and that is why the Rambam has to add on the words Hara Maria. Actually, the question arises, it has to do with Hilchas Avodah Zarah. And as we read in this week's Haftarah, today's Haftarah we read how all the mountains were utilized by the Yidden for Avodah Zarah. So there's an inyan that this spot, question arises, why didn't this spot, when a place is used for Avodah Zarah, it becomes asr, it becomes gasr. Elamai, we're going to say, Ein Adam Oiser, a person cannot asa a place which is not his. This B'negei Avodah Zarah, the Rebbe says, this applies only to machshava and dibur. However, if a Maisa Avodah Zarah was done on a certain spot, or on a certain area, this area becomes asa. So the question, if so, arises, how was it that the Yidden were able to build the Beis HaMikdash on that spot? Obviously, prior to the building of the Beis HaMikdash, there was worshipping to Avodah Zarah going on that spot. So how were they allowed to be able to build the Beis HaMikdash? The emes is, there's a pasuk in Yeshaya, where the pasuk in Yeshaya says, Navi Yeshaya, that time will come where all the ummis will be coming to this har, to the Har HaBayis, to be mispalel there. However, this does not help us, because L'Payel, there was an inyan of worshiping to Avodah Zarah on this har, on this mountain. However, Avraham Avinu, who lived much, much before all this, Avraham Avinu proclaimed this har, as we say every day in davening, Har Hashem Yerah. We say every day, we say the Akedah, Vayikra Avraham Shem HaMokem Ahu, Hashem Yireh, Asher Omer Hayoim, Behar Hashem Yerah. So Avraham Avinu, when he was at this Har HaBayis, trying to bring Yitzchak for a Noilah, he already proclaimed this as a site for Avodas Hashem. And set aside this site as a site for Avodas Hashem. And therefore, he made it already for a public place by saying these words, by calling the name Vayikra Avraham Shem HaMokem Ahu Hashem Yirah She'omer Hayoim Behar Hashem Yerah. Therefore, even though later throughout the years till the Beis HaMikdash was built, there was worshipping of Avodah Zarah on this spot, on this site, on this mountain. However, Avraham Avinu was it mafkiya, he accomplished already by making it a public har, so that no individual should be able to come later, even by Maisa, and asering this spot. So that is why, when the Rambam comes to tell us which area, the area where the Beis HaMikdash was built on, the Rambam mentions Har HaBayis. However, why was it possible that how was it possible that this area should be the Har HaBayis? It was because Hu Har Maria. When Avraham Avinu took his son, then it was called Har Maria. Because of the act of Avraham Avinu Bahar Maria, that Avraham acted then and he proclaimed it. Vayikra Avraham Shem HaMokem Ahu Hashem Yireh Asher Omer Hayoim Behar Hashem Yereh. That is why in later years this was able to become the Har HaBayis, that the Yidden were able to build there the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, the Rambam just doesn't quote it as a historic name, an additional historic name to the site, or to tell us the various other names which the site has. It is negei lahalacha to know that Har HaBayis Hu Har Maria, being that it was Har Maria, that is why it was able to become the Har HaBayis, and that it was able to become the Har HaBayis, as that the Beis HaMikdash should be built on it with all the details which the Rambam gets into. And the Rebbe concluded that let us hope that through the learning of all these inyanim of Beis HaMikdash, we will be zeicha to have the Beis HaMikdash in a reality, not just to learn the inyanim of Beis HaMikdash, but really to have the Beis HaMikdash in the nigladik way, and revealed in front of our eyes, where we should be physically able to go and do the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe expressed himself in one of the previous sichas when he was talking about the inyan of the Masos, that we do not make any interruptions during the Masoyos, during the journeys, but we go right away, straight out of Mitzrayim until Yarden Yereichai, which is reflecting the Inyan of Geula, we shall hope that we should be able to have the Geula yet in this year, in the year of Tavshim Mem Beis, by the coming of Mashiach. Thank you. Tavshim Mem Gimel. Mem Beis passed already. It must be Mem Gimel. Tavshim Mem Gimel, by the coming of Mashiach, taking us out of this long and bitter gullus and taking us La'artzeinu HaKadosh. A gute Woche.